Episode 7, Islam in Africa. Question 1. Based on what you know about the relative differences between Islam and Christianity, which religion might have been less destructive of African culture and had a better chance of being a genuinely African religion? Though both Islam and Christianity are monotheistic religions, each requiring exclusive devotion to their one God, the manner and timing by which they spread into the African continent dramatically affected their respective impacts on the cultures they encountered. Islam was founded as a proselytizing faith, from the very beginning seeking to expand their population of believers. This primarily took the forms of warfare or trade. Islam was contemptuous of and hostile towards non-Abrahamic religions, that is, religions outside of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Muslims saw the almost universal polytheistic animist faiths of sub-Saharan Africa as affronts to Allah. That being said, Muslims generally embraced voluntary conversions of newly conquered or encountered peoples, though slavery and the status of converted slaves complicated this. Importantly, the religious conversion that occurred in Africa did not have a particularly cultural agenda. Islam was comparatively egalitarian. Once an individual has converted, they are seen as an equal member of the religious community. The cultural idiosyncrasies of newly converted populations was not a concern as long as the core religious principles of Islam were observed. It should also be emphasized that Islam spread into West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the eastern Swahili coast through trade. Armed expansion was geographically limited, with jungle, desert, and climate inhibiting the large-scale military invasion that was characteristic in southeastern Europe, the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, and South Asia. Because trade and not conquest was the vehicle for conversion, there was necessarily an element of diplomacy and consideration involved. The same cannot be said for the spread of Christianity. As with Islam, there is nothing inherently xenophobic contained within Christian teachings. The intolerant manner in which Christianity spread throughout Africa is a function of historical circumstance rather than religious tenets. Christianity had its beginnings in the same area as Judaism and Islam, but its association with first the Roman Empire and then the Byzantine Empire, and the westward contraction of each in the face of both nomadic and Muslim incursions, isolated Christianity in a racially homogeneous Western Europe. The Muslim conquest of Africa's Mediterranean coast, and indeed the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, meant that Europeans had only limited interaction with cultures other than Islamic ones. Christianity thus developed along provincial lines rather than Islam's more cosmopolitan ones. When large-scale contact with African and South Asian cultures began in the 1400s, Christianity was firmly entrenched as a European or white religion. Compounding this monoculturalism was the Portuguese and Spanish attitudes towards slavery. Slavery had faded from post-Roman Europe as the labor pool was replaced by feudal serfdom. In the Muslim world, slavery was commonplace, and because Muslims occupied Spain and Portugal for centuries, they were the parts of the Christian world most familiar with slavery. As primarily Portuguese voyages pushed further south, the Spanish exploration would soon focus on the Americas, into equatorial and sub-equatorial Africa, they encountered decentralized and animist cultures that they would eventually enslave by the millions. The Christianity that would eventually expand out into the world was monocultural and interwoven with imperial conquest. Conversion was used as a tool of conquest and subjugation, and so even the converted were seen as inferior. In essence, Christianity spread alongside intolerance, whereas Islam was much more cosmopolitan and accepting in its approach to newly encountered peoples. Islam was therefore more accommodating in its proselytizing and far less transformative and destructive than Christianity would prove to be for the African people. Question 2. Contrast the politically decentralized nature of some African societies with the more formally organized societies we have looked at so far. What effect did the lack of a formal government structure have on power distribution and the socio-economic order? Though some African societies had a centralized ruling authority and can more accurately be referred to as states, many others developed around a kinship or a loose tribute based fealty, for lack of a better word. These societies would lack the formal power structures and political systems that are associated with states. There were some forms of government, but in the place of a centralized executive role, think king, there was instead a council of families or a community that might have shared decision making. These societies had little significant concentrations of populations and wealth, and so lacked the specialization of roles that naturally resulted in the hierarchies that characterized the more formally organized states. In addition, because there was no political or military establishment to support, there was no need for formal taxation. In these societies, government was rarely a full time occupation, and so there was no political class. Such societies were thus often less hierarchical and more egalitarian. Question 3. What were the drawbacks of a politically decentralized society? Decentralized societies could be enormously successful, enduring for lengthy spells and sustaining sophisticated ethno linguistic identities. These societies were well capable of maintaining an internal cohesion. However, decentralized societies were ill equipped to resist external pressures, mobilize for warfare, organize large building projects, or create stable conditions for continuous long distance trade with other peoples. In isolation, a decentralized state could thrive, but contact with more formally centralized states often resulted in defeat and dissolution. Question 4. What were the functions of animism in the development of African culture? Animistic religions typically find spiritual connection through natural phenomena. Many African peoples shared an underlying belief in a creator deity whose power and intent were communicated through spirits or lesser gods and, significantly, through the founding ancestors of the group. The ancestors held a founder status and were viewed as the first settlers and thus the true owners of the land and local resources. Through the ancestors, the fertility of the land, game, people, and herds could be curated. Among some groups, working the land took on a religious significance, granting the land itself a meaning beyond mere economic utility. Question 5. How did African religious beliefs affect the socio-economic order? African spirituality held that a soul or spirit would exist in every object, whether alive or inanimate. Africans, like Europeans, believed that evil and misfortune were the product of a malevolent adversary, witches, the devil, etc. Specialists would thus be needed to counter this malevolency, leading, in the case of many societies, to the existence of a class of diviners or priests who provided for the spiritual health and protection of the community. African religion provided a cosmology, an explanation of reality, and a code of ethics and behavior. Religion, economics, and history are thus all interwoven. The family, lineage, or clan that provided the framework for many African societies also had an important spiritual function. Deceased ancestors often were a direct link between living relatives and the spirit world. Veneration of ancestors and gods thus became central to African spiritual traditions. Because the connection to the spirit world was tied to family and land, there was little in the way of a formal religious hierarchy. Each person worked the land and was thus in touch with the divine. The inability for an individual or group to monopolize religion was one of the primary limiting factors on the concentration of power. Question 6. In what ways was Islam attractive to potential African converts? The fundamental tenet that all members of the Muslim community are equal made the acceptance of conquerors and new rulers easier. The tradition within Islam of merging the secular state powers with those of the religious community would have been particularly attractive to African kings. The pre existing animist tradition tended to reserve spiritual leadership to the priest shaman class and political power to the kings. The concept that all members of the Ummah, or community of believers, are equal would in theory put the Berbers and other African ethnicities or populations on an equal footing with the Arab Muslims. It is necessary to note that there were often significant gaps between the spirit of Islam and its actual implementation. There remain throughout Muslim Africa significant economic and ethnic divisions and hierarchies. It should also be noted that the benefits of conversion were most appealing to urban dwellers, skewing towards the upper classes. Often there was little real benefit for pastoral peoples, who tended to retain their animist beliefs. Question 7. What was it about the Sahel that prompted the growth of centralized states there? How do camels factor into this? Areas of transition between different zones tend to take on an added importance beyond their local resources. Think the Middle East. On the edge of the Sahara Desert, states such as Ghana had already formed by exchanging gold from the forests of West Africa for salt or dates from the Sahara or for goods from Mediterranean Africa. As is so often the case throughout history, the significance of relatively mundane logistical factors can have an outsized influence on long term developments. There are few better examples of this than the role of camels. Camels introduced from Asia to the Sahara had greatly improved the possibilities of trade. Camels, however, only thrived in arid and semi arid conditions, not the humid forest zones where they were vulnerable to disease. Thus, the Sahel, the grasslands at the southern edge of the Sahara, became a point of exchange between the humid forest zones to the south and the arid regions to the north. The Sahel's location meant that it was perfectly poised to facilitate this trade, and several African states consequently developed in that region. Question 8. In what ways did Islam serve the interests of many different groups in the Sudanic societies? The spread of Islam in sub Saharan Africa came in several forms. Muslim merchants became established in cities throughout the region, and accordingly, religious communities developed. Trade networks were established widely as both merchants and pastoral groups established their outposts in the region of Guinea. Muslim traders, herders, warriors, and religious leaders became important minorities in these often segmented African societies. Muslim influence varied widely from region to region, but families of traders and lineages that became known as specialists in Muslim law spread widely throughout the region. By the 1700s, Muslim minorities were scattered across West Africa, common even in areas where no Islamicized state had developed. Essentially, the qualities of the Muslim community were valued for their own sake, separate from their political relevance. Question 9. How does slavery expose a degree of hypocrisy in the Muslim world? In theory, Muslims viewed slavery as an oftentimes necessary stage in the process of conversion, but in reality, conversion did not automatically confer freedom. Slaves in the Islamic world were used in a variety of occupations, as domestic servants and laborers, soldiers, administrators who, having no local ties, were considered trustworthy and dependable, eunuchs, and concubines, hence the emphasis on enslaving children and women. Thus, though the Quran emphasizes the equality of members of the Ummah, in practice, conversion did little to disrupt patterns of enslavement and subjugation. Question 10. How is the Swahili culture a perfect illustration of globalism? By the 13th century, a network of urbanized trading ports proliferated the eastern coast of Africa. These towns shared the Bantu-based and Arabic-influenced Swahili language, which translates as coastal. Although these towns were governed by separate Muslim families, they had a shared cultural and linguistic foundation. As these trade centers flourished, they became even more opulent and impressive. The goods exchanged in these ports represented a connection between Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia, and the cosmopolitan nature of Swahili culture illustrates the growing regional interconnectedness. Swahili culture, ultimately, could not be said to be African, Arabic, or Muslim alone, with the added occasional appearance of a farther flung cultural influence. The Swahili coast can be seen as a nexus for intercultural contact in much the same way as the Levant. Question 11. Quote, the presence or absence of writing has often been used as a measure of civilization by Western observers. End quote. Assess this statement. Whereas Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia had developed writing, and other areas borrowed the Arabic script, many sub-Saharan African societies were pre-literate and transmitted their knowledge, skills, and traditions by oral methods and direct instruction. The presence or absence of writing has often been used as a measure of civilization by Western observers. But as in pre-Columbian Peru, various African societies made great strides in the arts, building, and statecraft, many times in the context of highly urbanized settings without a system of writing. The presence or absence of writing as a measure of civilization is therefore loaded with potential bias.